Everyone, welcome to Cave of the Cross Apologetics. I'm Patrick.
And I'm Tony.
We're in the middle of telling you about 5 different things that science cannot talk about, and therefore we should reject science completely. That's not what we're doing. We're just saying here that there are 5 things which we know about and talk about on a consistent basis that science cannot explain, and that doesn't go against science, but it's just saying that there are other knowledge factors out there that give us knowledge, like philosophy and all these other things. And there's actually a better argument out there than just science, the naturalistic view of science, and that is, of course, theism. And so that's what J.P. Moreland's doing here in our book, and we've made it through the first 2. And if you thought you overpaid, well, guess what? We're going to give you 3 more on top of it. Fine-tuning and the existence of God. So what does all this have to do with the existence of God? Well, in the last several years, scientists have made a discovery so shocking that it's played a prominent role in leading to atheistic thinker Anthony Flew,'s conversion to a belief in God. Now, again, he didn't come out and be a full-on Christian here. He came out to be a deist, but as someone who did so much work in the kind of atheistic sphere of things, talking about things like being a default atheist until you have enough evidence to kind of believe in a deity being a better explanation. Well, he did that. He set up the goal, he met the challenge, and so he crossed over into at least the deist point. Which again, okay, you're halfway there. You're William Lane Craig on Pier 1. It would have been nice to jump to Pier 2. All right, so what was this discovery? Well, it was that the universe is precisely fine-tuned so that life could appear. More than 100 independent, hard facts about the universe have been discovered in the form of basic constants of nature. Excuse me, hold on. Okay. Of the form of basic constants of nature or arbitrary physics magnitudes, which are, scientifically speaking, brute facts, and for which there is no further scientific explanation. So an example of this would be that the force of gravity in the universe, or the charge of an electron, or the rest mass of a proton, the rate of expansion resulting from the Big Bang. All these things are just brute facts, and so there's no scientific explanation for them. So what blows the mind of so many is that if any single one of these, much less all 100 that have been kind of notated or discovered, had been slightly larger or slightly smaller on the order of a billionth of a percentage point or more, then no life could have appeared in the universe. Theoretical physicist Paul Davies acknowledged that the seemingly miraculous concurrence of numerical values that nature has assigned to her fundamental constants must remain the compelling evidence for an element of cosmic design. So again, all these 100 factors, and so just think about it. You probably heard of the Earth being within the Goldilocks zone, but that might be able to be explained away. But these fundamental factors of things like gravity or the charge of an electron and all these things, they must be the case for life to exist. And again, we talked about this in our book with Mitch Stokes, How to Be an Atheist, where it says that he was saying that scientists have acknowledged this to a certain degree, that things like even evolution, again, not all of the universe, but even evolution as a design factor is so precisely needed to fall within the confines of probability that you have to postulate all these other universes to exist. So the multi-universe has to be made in order for us to kind of skew with the percentage factor. And so, of course, this universe, out of all the universes, has life, because in an almost infinite number of universes, this is just one, and this is the one where aren't we just so lucky to have life pop up into existence from nothing, and nothing exploded, and then it created everything, and then evolution happened, and we're here today talking to you because of nothing exploding, and it rained on the rocks for millions of years, and lightning struck it, and even though you don't have non-life produce life at any other point, it did this one time because we're a universe in a multitude of universes, and so it just happened. So
we're a universe in need of coming into existence.
Yes.
And so he says that's really the response of the naturalists. He says the main attempt by naturalists is to avoid the argument by postulating what you suggested here, the many worlds hypothesis, according to which there is a world ensemble containing an infinite number of actual concrete universes parallel to our own, with which we are incapable of interacting, so we don't know about them, right? We can't interact with them in any way, including scientific means of interacting. And so he says, given that each world in this world ensemble of, universes would have its own combination of values for its constants, right? These are these universal constants that he's talked about, the fine-tuning things, and arbitrary physical magnitudes. And it's probable that there will be many universes from this huge number of, universes that contain beings capable of observing their own universe. And thus, says the objector, it is necessary that our observed universe be one that contains the right combination of constants and magnitudes, because if it did not, guess what? We would not be here to debate the question. So there, it has to exist because of the multiple many worlds hypothesis. So there, that's what the naturalists try to get away with in terms of their explanation.
Right. Well, and I remember reading about this in Michael Crichton's Timeline, which I did not like whatsoever. There was too much explaining and not enough plot. But he talked about how these multi-universes, it wasn't time travel that happened, but it just so happened that there were so many universes that it only appeared to be time travel when you sent your explorers to a different universe. And
that's pretty.
But then you realize that, we don't have the power to bring them back. And so you just send them to a universe that has the power to send them back. But I was always thinking, like, okay, so if those universes have the ability to interact with other universes, then there has to be a universe out there that has the ability to explode all the other universes. And so there should only be one universe, which is ours, because we're the universe that exploded all the other universes, right?
There can only be one.
So I'm just saying, if you're going to go all out on this multiverse thing, I too want to go all out. Well, Moreland goes on to say that in his view, the many worlds hypothesis fails to be plausible. For one thing, since we cannot interact with parallel concrete universes, there's no hard scientific evidence for their existence.
And I think this is a good point, right? I mean, it's for all practical purposes, it's just something that we could say is made up, right? To give an explanation, right? Can we interact with these? No. Can we be aware of them? No. There's no hard scientific evidence for these, but they have to be there because we got to get around theism. And so this is our way, right? Well, come on, really?
Right. Yeah, exactly. So further, the many worlds hypothesis is a prime example of a bloated worldview, the very opposite of scientism prized values of simplicity and elegance. Again, the good old Occam's razor comes into play here. It tends to be used by both sides, and both sides probably overuse it as well. But this seems to be the goblins in the clock explanation here. And finally, the hypothesis proves too much. While advocates take the hypothesis to allow it to avoid the conclusions that the universe resulted from an intentional creative action by God, I think it also derives, he says, one to avoid believing in other intentional actions by us humans.
Right. So it proves too much. So what exactly is it getting at? Well, I think I like his illustration here, right? Because he says what happens is that it drives one to avoid believing in any intentional actions by humans. And so he gives this illustration about playing bridge, I think. He says, suppose we have a pot of $500 for the winner of our bridge game, and that he's the dealer. All right, so there's $500 in the pot, and you're the dealer. And he says, on the first deal, surprise, I give myself a perfect winning hand.
The math, it works.
Yeah, he tells us the others at the table rightly accuse me of doing an intentional act, purposely cheating. Well, no, duh, right? And of course, he responds by noting that, well, in the many worlds ensemble, there are many, many worlds, and we just happen to be in the concrete universe where I get a winning hand on the first deal. And of course, he says, surely such an explanation is bogus.
No, it's just the science.
Too much, right? But, the next time we cheat at cards, we can say, but the many worlds ensemble explanation.
Right. You've shuffled the cards and you shuffle one more time. The possibility of you shuffling so that all the spades and the hearts and the diamonds, the clubs are all together in sequential order is possible, right? It's one of the possibilities. And so if you did it, you're not doing a magic trick. You're just doing science. So you shouldn't. It's just a random event, and you shouldn't be surprised by it whatsoever.
So magic is science, and science is magic.
Yeah. Yes. Exactly. All right. Well, how about the fourth one? So we've done three. Here's the fourth one. Science cannot explain the origin of consciousness. And so we talked a little bit about this, I think 4 episodes ago at this point.
Chapters ago.
Yeah. So we talked about this a little bit, but he makes the case a little bit stronger here. And again, he's saying why theism can explain this better than science can. Well, various features of human person, consciousness being among them, have provided very serious problems for scientific naturalism. But consciousness is easily explained, given theism. Given naturalism, there's just no place to put consciousness. Well, it's just this thing that the brain does, it's fizzing chemicals. Okay, then am I really held responsible for my actions? Because it's just fizzing chemicals, and I just fizz at a different degree than you do, right? So you can't hold me responsible as a serial killer. It's just the way that my chemicals fizz. And so who's to say which one of us is right or wrong? Now, you can say might makes right, and you can have an intentionality of the will that way, but that's not what we talk about when we talk about things like justice or holding people responsible or even what the purpose of laws is for. Well, given naturalism, there's just no place to put the consciousness. So the naturalist either has to say, one, it has to say that these things like feeling of pain just aren't what they seem to be from the first person introspective, and instead they are actually physical things, or else two, they have to deny that they're real in the first place. Consciousness does not really exist. Well, look, you can be a Buddhist and still be a naturalistic scientist here.
Right. So either consciousness is not consciousness, at least from our first person introspection viewpoint, or consciousness doesn't exist. Those are your options if you're a naturalist.
Right. But if we reject naturalism and the strictly physicalist ontology, the view of reality, it implies and accept the common sense view of the way things are, we can perilously close the embracing of theism. So it seems to make more sense that theism allows us to have consciousness, where just this idea of purely a naturalistic scientific explanation would void even bringing that up. The implications of that are just too much for people to take a bite of. If you do that, well, then you have other factors involved. Again, this is like the idea of not believing that there are other minds, but then writing a book to tell other people that they are in other minds. Who are you writing that book to? You're just being the only brain in the vat, and you're just kind of playing with yourself there.
Right. And who pays you for the book?
Right.
So he gives us reasons why he thinks that science cannot explain the origin of mental states. Several of them here. So first, it's the uniformity of nature. He says on a naturalistic depiction of matter, it is brute, mechanical, physical stuff. That's it. Right. And the emergence then of consciousness, he tells us, seems to be a case of getting something from nothing. Right. So you have this brute, mechanical, physical stuff, and then boom, consciousness springs from nothing. Right. So he says, how can like causes produce radically different effects? What are the like causes? Well, these brute, mechanical, physical stuff, those are like causes. How can then this radically different effect, consciousness, comes out of it? He says the appearance of the mind is therefore utterly unpredictable and inexplicable from the naturalistic perspective.
Right. And, there are other things implied here too. Like, how about the nature of beauty? Well, the fact that there are things like pleasing factors. Well, those are just chemical responses. Of finding a baby cute is a evolutionary imperative so that you don't kill your own kids, right? Which is a legitimate suggestion made within the confines of the scientific community of why babies are cute. It's not just the fact that we recognize things like beauty, or how about music? Music has both a mathematical component to it, but also a beauty aspect to it. And so why do we find one tune beautiful, and then when I play the piano, it shows that there is such a thing as beauty and not beauty in the world there. So there are other things of this mental state that come into play here. All right. Well, second is a contingency of the mind-body correlation. The regular correlation between types of mental states and physical states seem radically contingent. Why do pains instead of itches, thoughts or of feelings or of love get correlated with specific brain states? No amount of knowledge of the brain state will help to answer this question. Again, we talked a little bit about this last time as well. Given the requirement of a causal necessitation for naturalistic causation explanations, given the cause, the effect must happen. There, in principle, is no naturalistic explanation for either the existence of mental states or their regular correlation with physical states. Why do they match up? Why can't we, be set on fire and laugh? Why is this the case?
I guess we could, but
right. And then we know something's wrong, right?
Yeah.
For the naturalist, the regularity of mind-body correlations must be taken as contingent brute facts. This is just what happens and must be the case because that's what it is. But these facts are inexplicable from a naturalistic standpoint, and they are radically unique compared to all other entities in our naturalistic ontology. So they're so unique that they provide this issue where you just must shrug your shoulders and go, well, that's just the way that it is, then maybe you need a better explanatory power there.
Yeah. Thirdly, he says epiphenomenalism and causal closure is an issue here. He says most naturalists believe that their worldview requires that all entities are either physical or at least depend upon the physical for their existence and behavior. And thus, if mental phenomena are genuinely non-physical, then they must be epiphenomenal, right? That is, effects caused by the physical that do not themselves have causal powers. So there's kind of an ethereal type of things that hover over the physical, right? They don't have any causal powers, they're just there. That's the basic idea here. And so he says it is not the feeling of thirst that causes you to drink, right? The feeling is just kind of an epiphenomenal thing, right? Rather, it is a certain brain state that causes you to drink water. Right. And so on this understanding, the feeling of thirst, even if it is real, cannot cause anything. But epiphenomenalism, he tells us, is false and therefore should be rejected.
Right. And, this comes into play, too, when we talk about, kind of triumph of the will. How can someone push themselves past what normal human limitations should be? Why don't you automatically find the source of water when you're thirsty rather than, saving a drowning child? What makes you kind of pick the choice, not just go, well, my body is this physical entity and it's telling me to do this, so I must robotically walk towards the source of water rather than the other source of water? Why is that the case? Why do we have these great feats of kind of mental fortitude that come about that we hold in high regard as a society? Well, maybe because at one point society held those things in certain regards, and we rejected people that just operated on their base physicality. But hopefully that will go away as soon as well. All right, so it's false for at least two reasons. Well, first, it's self-refuting. If our mental states, such as the state of being aware of good reasons for a conclusion, are epiphenomenal, then they do not have a role in our drawing of the conclusion. Thus, any argument that gave reason for believing in epiphenomenalism would play no role in that belief. So acceptance of epiphenomenalism would not be based on rational considerations, and it would be self-refuting. Again, not something that you want.
And then secondly, he tells us that mental causation seems undeniable, right? Remember, the epiphenomenalist says that these mental consciousness types of things, they don't causally interact, and so they don't cause anything. But he suggests that mental causation seems undeniable. His feeling of thirst causes him to get a drink of water. His beliefs causes him to act in a certain way. And yet, he says, for the naturalist, the mental can be allowed to have causal powers only if it is in some way or another identified with the physical, right? And so he thinks that the reliance on some naturalists, on the idea of epiphenomenal non-physical mental entities should be taken as a refutation of naturalism. Right? By using this as an explanation, he suggests it's a refutation of naturalism. Why? Well, he quotes D.M. Armstrong, who admits that he supposes that if the principles involved in analyzing the single, all-embracing spatial-temporal system, which is reality, were completely different, i.e., mental, right, or consciousness type, from the current principles of physics, in particular, if they involved appeal to mental entities, such as purposes, then Armstrong tells us we might then count the analysis as a falsification of naturalism. And so that's what J.P. Moreland is suggesting here, right? If indeed naturalists can't explain these things other than what it seems like by intentionality and purpose and that sort of thing, then that seems a refutation or falsification of naturalism.
Right. All right, how about the fourth one? The inadequacy of evolutionary explanations is there. Naturalists are committed to the view that, in principle, evolutionary explanations can be proffered for the appearance of all organisms and their parts. There are three aspects to this basic idea: the atom we start with, the laws we use to combine them, and the resulting complexes. The combinatorial style may be suited for explaining how complex structure arrangements of neurons could arise, but is completely inadequate to explain how the property of being a pain, a simple quality, that is not a structural arrangement of parts could take place in a purely physical world. Right. So, how does pain come about in the world? Well, it's just this naturalistic response to keeping you alive. So you move your hand away from the fire. Well, but at what point did that arise? What atom or what building block within your DNA structure tells you to do that? So it doesn't seem to have that explanatory power for the arising of being a pain.
Yeah. All right. So what he's done here is he's given us 4 reasons why science cannot explain the origin of mental states, right? The uniformity of nature, the contingency of the mind-body correlation, the epiphenomenalism and the causal closure, and the inadequacy of evolutionary explanations. So this now is the 5th thing that science cannot in principle explain, but theism can. And number 5 is science cannot explain the existence of moral, rational, and aesthetic objective laws and intrinsically valuable properties. And so you kind of hinted at this in some of your earlier comments here. But he says most people acknowledge the existence of objectively true laws in morality, rationality, and aesthetics. The problem, he tells us, for scientism is that science is descriptive and not prescriptive. Science attempts to describe what is the case, but it cannot prescribe what ought to be the case. And thus, science must remain silent, he tells us, when it comes to normative laws and principles.
Right, right. Why ought gravity be a thing? Well, this is what it is, right? That's what it is. But why ought it be even a thing? Well, because that's just how it is, right? But ought. Why is it the case? Now, if the universe began with a being who was himself the bearer of intrinsic goodness, rationality, and beauty, then there's no problem with how these things could exist or from where they come. However, if scientism is true, the entire history of the universe is a story of how strictly physical things, strings, waves, particles, etc., with strictly personal properties, mass, charge, size, location, and so forth, combine accordingly to the laws of nature to form other strictly physical things with strictly physical properties.
So everything is physical according to scientism, right? So how in the world do these things like goodness and rationality and beauty and that kind of stuff come into existence when we have these physical things, right, that are strict, that have physical properties, and they're combined by physical, strictly physical things with other strictly physical properties and so forth, right? Everything is physical, turtles all the way down.
Right. So anytime that you tell your wife or your mother or your children or your best friend that you love them, what you're saying is that your chemicals fizz in such a way that they fizz in a certain particular way that they don't fizz with other people, unless if they do, and then you're fine to discard your children and friends and wives for others. And it's just how you were. It's how evolution made you as a fizzing being. And there's nothing that you could say that says why you ought not to leave your children on the side of the road when you're bored with them one day.
Honey, I fizzy you.
Yeah, it's just physical. Yeah. Well, there's no need or room for intrinsic normative value properties, whether moral, rational, or aesthetic, to come to be. As the late atheist philosopher J.L. Mackie admitted, the emergence of moral properties would constitute a refutation of naturalism and evidence for theism. Moral properties constitute so odd a cluster of properties and relations that they are more likely to have arisen in the ordinary course of events without an all-powerful God to create them. Again, the quotes from atheists are always very helpful in these cases.
All right, so that is this chapter 12, right? He concludes by saying, so here we have 5 distinct phenomena that science simply cannot explain, even in principle. And they do, however, he tells us, fit quite nicely within theism. And so he concludes that these features support theism and provide strong evidence against scientism, which is that philosophical position that science explains everything. So we don't need any other explanation. All right, so that's chapter 12.
Yep. And moving on to 13, we're going to get more into this debate of evolution versus intelligent design, and he's going to make the case for one of those positions. I won't spoil anything yet because you might not have chapter. And so we'll cover that next time in chapter 13. And so thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.